Welcome to this edition of Inside the Capitol from Outside the Capitol. The 2018 legislative session is wrapped up, and we wanted to let you know what happened this session. And in order to do that, we sat down with the Executive Director of the Minnesota Catholic Conference, Jason Adkins, and asked him what were some of the things that passed and didn't pass this legislative session. So this was a short session, but still many important pieces of legislation were passed. Can you tell us about some of the pieces of legislation that did pass that the Minnesota Catholic Conference was advocating for?
Our advocacy this year focused on two themes. One, combating the commodification of human persons and caring for our common home. We're really excited because our anti-pornography legislation that connects pornography and human trafficking passed this year and passed unanimously. That's an important conversation to have at the Capitol, and we're hoping to build on that success and bring greater attention to this issue going forward. Similarly, it was the first time that opponents of surrogacy put forward their own legislation to regulate surrogacy and to make sure we're eliminating its most egregious abuses, particularly in the commercial surrogacy market. Similarly, we had some important legislation introduced this year regarding recycled water in the form of gray water legislation, which is an important development in terms of being good water stewards. And another feature of caring for our common home is also making sure that people have homes and access to homes. And so we're excited that over $90 million in affordable housing bonds were passed this year as well.
So sometimes fighting to keep something from becoming a law is just as important as advocating for something to become a law. Can you also tell us about a few pieces of legislation this year that we were advocating to actually keep from passing?
We were opposed to gambling expansion this session, and with the Supreme Court ruling that states can now open their states to more gambling and sports gambling, we know how addictive that can be, especially when there's gambling and sports gambling opportunities right on your phone. We're really worried about how that's going to impact families, our economy, personal bankruptcies, public costs related to that. And so we're very glad that our state legislators rejected that and rejected making it definitively legal. Sure, it's happening, but we wanted to make sure that the state wasn't creating a framework for the business to grow here in Minnesota. Similarly, again, there's an ongoing discussion about surrogacy, and surrogacy proponents are trying to legitimize it through the back door, recognizing that they're going to have difficulty because of our efforts at creating their enabling statute or the regulatory framework. So they tried to slip it into a provision regarding a stillborn tax credit. We were able to keep that provision out of the stillborn tax credit legislation as well. So again, like you said, Sean, sometimes defeating legislation is almost as important as getting legislation passed.
So hundreds of Catholic Advocacy Network members contacted their legislators during this session on several different pieces of legislation. Can you tell us a little bit about the impact that they had on those pieces of legislation this session?
It's really important that we acknowledge the great work of the Catholic Advocacy Network and all our members and district leaders and parish contacts who really helped educate people in the pew about important issues, join with us, and were great partners, and then help get legislation passed this year. So a hearty thank you to all the members of the Catholic Advocacy Network. But really, the everyday work of politics is about making incremental positive change. And a lot of our bills and our legislation were emblematic of that this year, particularly anti-trafficking pornography legislation, where we were able to get that introduced this year and then get that signed into law this year. And our Catholic advocates, our faithful citizens, were able to follow that from introduction. They were able to advocate it for themselves. They were able to go to bill hearings and then see legislation happening in a positive way. We didn't ban pornography. We didn't end the human trafficking problem, but what we did is start moving that discussion in a positive direction. And that's the everyday work of politics, and helping people be encouraged that positive change can happen. Rome wasn't built in a day, but we have to keep working for the common good and building human dignity. And so I think that was a great lesson for our network this year, is to watch a piece of legislation like that unfold and then build bridges across the partisan aisle too. So that was fantastic.
So school's out for the summer, the legislature's out for the summer and fall. So we've got an election coming up. But what really is next in terms of legislative advocacy and political advocacy in general? And then also, what can our Catholic Advocacy Network members continue to do to stay engaged in the process?
The legislature may be out of session, but the work of advocacy goes on, especially heading into an election season where we're going to be electing a new governor, electing 2 U.S. senators, our congressional members, a state house, full state house, and then statewide offices as well. And really, legislators and public officials need you as a resource. They need the people in the pew as a resource to help them understand what the issues are and what their constituents care about. So especially in election season, when public officials are out door knocking, going into neighborhoods, visiting fairs and pancake breakfasts and kissing babies and all that, it's important that the people in the pew build those relationships and help legislators understand what the key issues are. Legislators often have 2 or 3 big priorities and then really are open to what their constituents tell them, especially on important issues. So it's very important that people in the pew stay engaged with their legislators, and we want to provide the resources to help them do that.
Jason, thank you very much for joining us today and giving our viewers some good insight into some of the things that the Minnesota Catholic Conference advocated for this session and how those pieces of legislation ended up. You can stay involved this summer by signing up for the Catholic Advocacy Network. Go to mncatholic.org and sign up today. Thank you for joining us for this wrap-up edition of Inside the Capitol. Continue to watch for new episodes each month. Until then, make sure you share this video with your friends, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and join us for the next edition of Inside the Capitol.